They called her trash, but he called her real. In a galaxy where perfection is law and the broken are left to rot, one discarded alien girl was never meant to survive. No name, no purpose, just pain. Until one man, a human outsider with scars of his own, chose her. He didn't see a defect. He saw someone worth saving. And when she screamed through fire and metal, when her body trembled and her voice broke, he stayed. She was never supposed to walk. But that night, under burning lights and blood-soaked steel, she ran straight into war just to save him. Under a skyless void where no sun ever reached, Mora's station drifted like a wound. No one cared to heal its hull. A collage of rust, graffiti, and blood too old to remember who spilled it. Pipes hissed, lights flickered with insect hums, and the stench of oil mixed with old plasma lingered in every breath, like the station itself was exhaling its last. Beneath a fractured support beam, in the deepest gutter of the market district, she moved barely. Her name was Kaela, though no one had said it in years. Bent spine, twisted leg, one arm that shook when she tried to hold even the weight of a scrap tin. She didn't walk, she dragged. Her skin, once a deep jade, now dull and flaked, a map of starvation and injury. They called her twitching worm or ground meat, and some whispered she had been born from a factory error, not a womb. She remembered none of that, only hunger, cold, and the feel of metal grates under her stomach as she crawled. On Muras, worth was measured in function. If you couldn't serve, steal, or sell, you were garbage. And Kaela had been garbage for longer than she could remember. She had no past, no future, just the next scrap of warmth, or bite of discarded food soft enough to chew with half-broken teeth. The guards came that day like they always did, metal boots, static breathers hissing over their jaws, armor blackened from some long-forgotten war. They laughed before they even reached her. One pointed with the butt of his shock pike. Still alive, he sneered. Thought she'd rot away by now. Another clicked his jaw. Mouths that don't work don't eat. Cleanup order. She tried to shrink, crawling backward into the shadows beneath the beam, but pain screamed through her spine like a live wire. One of them stepped forward, boot crunching bone, as he kicked her twisted leg. She didn't scream. She never did anymore. Do you think she can even feel pain? The youngest asked. The others laughed. They grabbed her by the arm claws piercing skin, dragged her like refuse toward the central square, her legs trailing behind like broken chains. The lights above buzzed, casting sickly blue over the alley as they passed. Vendors and looters stopped to watch. Cruelty was the only free entertainment on Muras. They threw her on a cold steel platform. Her body curled in on itself, limbs jerking like a dying insect. One of the guards barked out, "Who wants the freak? She's free. Can't walk, can't work. Take her before we vaporize the corpse." Laughter, sharper than the station's alarms, echoed around her. Someone threw a tin can, another spit, and then silence. Not the silence of indifference, but the kind that ripples through a crowd like sudden gravity. A shift in air, impossibility. A voice, steady as cut stone, "I'll take her." She didn't lift her head. She expected another boot, another joke. But the voice wasn't laughing. The crowd turned. He was tall, coat stained from travel, boots worn but upright. A human. Scar down his cheek like a signature written in blade. His eyes were ice blue, but not cold. Calm. Alive. He didn't flinch under the stares of 50 scavengers and mercs. "You serious?" A guard grunted, motioning to the twitching bundle at his feet. The human nodded once. "She's mine now. She's broken." "So was I," he said, and stepped forward. Kaela opened one eye. Just one. It was enough to see the silhouette of the man kneeling before her. One hand extended not with command or chain, but with stillness, patience. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said. "Can you hear me?" No one had asked her that in years. She didn't answer. Her throat was dry, tongue stuck to the roof of her mouth like wax. "My name is Calen Drake," he said, softer this time, like he wasn't speaking to her ears, but the part of her buried under rot and terror. "You don't have to be afraid of me." Still no answer. But then, for reasons she couldn't name, her fingers moved. Slowly, like digging up bones from old ground. Her hand, small, cold, shaking, reached toward his. Their skin touched. And for the first time in her memory, no one recoiled. Calen lifted her gently. Her body went limp, too shocked to resist, too broken to understand. The crowd murmured, unsure whether they were witnessing pity or madness. No one stopped him. No one dared. As he carried her through the smog-choked corridor back to his ship, someone whispered, "Humans are weird." Another spat behind him. "He'll regret it." But Kaela felt it. That moment, that shift, like a key turning in a lock, sealed long ago. Not pain, not fear. Something else. Something new. And deep in her chest, where nothing had stirred for so long, something small took its first breath. Hope. Beneath the fractured hum of Mura Station, where the air always tasted like burnt circuitry and the shadows moved even when nothing else did, Kaela lay weightless in the human's arms. The jeers of the crowd faded behind them, swallowed by the distant moan of rusted metal shifting in the station's bones. Her body sagged against his chest, too brittle to tense, too used to pain to flinch. But something beneath the numbness stirred quiet, careful, like a child pressing its fingers against a locked door. Inside his ship, everything felt wrong. The floor didn't scrape her belly, the walls didn't leak. The light wasn't a flicker but a soft amber warmth that reminded her of stories she thought she'd imagined before memory became survival. The air carried no stink of grease or blood, only the subtle scent of metal, solder, and something else. Cleanliness. As if even the dust knew better than to linger here. Calen Drake set her down on a cushioned bench with a care so deliberate it almost hurt. She blinked rapidly, adjusting not to brightness but to stillness. He didn't speak right away. He just moved smooth, efficient, but without threat. He pulled something from a compartment, a narrow bottle, silver-bodied, condensation forming along its spine. He offered it to her, not pushing, not rushing. She took it. Her fingers didn't grip, they trembled, more out of confusion than weakness. She sniffed the rim, expecting rust, decay, poison. "Water," he said simply. "Clean, you need it." She sipped. Cold flooded her mouth like lightning across cracked earth. She almost gagged. It wasn't foul, it wasn't warm or sour, it was real. Her eyes narrowed, darting around the room. Her voice, thin and unused, emerged like wind through broken glass. "You're not going to sell me?" His expression didn't change. "You're not for sale." Her fingers tightened around the bottle. "You're not going to use me?" That brought a flicker to his features, not pity. Something sharper, anger maybe, not at her. "No," he said slowly. "You're not an object. You're not theirs." Her shoulders stiffened, not because she disagreed, but because the words didn't fit, like wearing a name that wasn't hers. Her whole life had been a ledger of debt and damage. This wasn't how it worked. Kindness came with chains. Relief was the setup to a worse punishment. That was the rule. He didn't press, just nodded toward the corridor behind him. "You can rest. No one's going to hurt you here, not unless you count my cooking." She stared. A beat passed, then another. "You're human," she said, unsure if it was a question or an accusation. Calen nodded once. "Used to be anyway. Mura's has a way of rusting off the parts that make you feel like one." Her head tilted. "Why? Take me." He sat across from her, arms resting on his knees. His voice lowered, not secretive, just real. "Because I saw someone once on a station not unlike this. They needed help. I didn't reach out. I kept walking. Didn't even look back." His jaw clenched. "By the time I did, there wasn't anything left to help." She looked away, afraid his gaze might burn through the wall she'd spent years building brick by silent brick. "I'm not worth anything," she said flatly. "Not to anyone." Then they were blind, he said. No pause, no flourish. And somehow, that made it worse. He stood. "You need rest. I'll be in the engine room if you need anything. Or nothing. That's allowed too." He left her there. Alone. In silence, not filled by hissing vents or distant screams. Just silence. Kaela stared at the floor. Her hands still shook, but not from fear. She wasn't sure what it was. Her body screamed that this was a trick, a game, a delay before pain returned. But another voice buried under years of filth and fury whispered something else. What if it wasn't? What if this human, meant it? She looked down at the silver bottle in her lap, her reflection staring back in the water's surface. Not grotesque, not useless, just there. And in her chest, where only emptiness had lived for so long, something flickered again. Not fire, but the memory of it. She watched him from the corner of her cot, arms folded over her knees like they were the only pieces of herself still intact. For 3 nights, Calen had tended to her in silence. Not the silence of avoidance, but of presence, the kind that said, "I'm not leaving," even without words. He cleaned her wounds like he'd done it before. Too well, too practiced. The pressure of his fingers spoke of experience, the gentle steadiness of someone who'd lost more than he let on. His ship wasn't luxurious. It creaked in low orbit. It groaned against the weight of time. But it was clean, honest. A heartbeat humming softly through the metal frame, like it belonged to something still alive. She expected him to eventually stop. They all stopped. When the novelty faded, when the pity ran dry, they moved on. But Calen didn't. He kept showing up, kept bringing warm broth and dry towels, kept adjusting her brace when it slipped, kept offering silence when words failed. Then, on the 4th night, he entered carrying something unfamiliar, a small, scratched metal case that pulsed faintly, like something inside was still breathing. She sat up straighter, instinctively recoiling. "What is that?" He paused, then placed it gently on the table between them. His voice didn't waver. "Neural mech scaffolding. Military issue. It's old, but it still works." Her pulse surged. She shook her head before he even finished. "Number, I've felt enough pain." He knelt, not too close. Not threatening, just there, on her level, letting the shadows fall where they may. "Not all pain breaks you, Kaela. Some of it builds." She turned away, but the tremor in her hands betrayed her. "You think strapping machines to me will make me less broken?" "No," he said simply. "Because you were never broken." She scoffed, bitter. "You don't know me." "I know enough," he replied, his tone darkening with a weight she hadn't heard before. "I know what it looks like when someone stops believing they matter. I know what it feels like to stand over someone dying and realize I didn't do enough. I've been there." She looked at him then, not fully, but enough to catch a flicker behind his eyes, something raw. A burn scar that wasn't on his skin, but somewhere deeper. "You were a soldier." "I was a medic," he corrected. "They trained me to fix things. Bodies, brains, engines. Never told me how to fix what comes after." He opened the case. Inside were sleek, curved strips of dark metal, coiled cables like veins waiting to be connected. The tech looked almost alive, whispering with dormant energy. She stared. Her heart beat faster, not from fear, but from something far more dangerous hope. "It's your choice," he said, standing. "I won't do it unless you say yes." She bit her lip hard enough to taste blood. Her leg, twisted and lifeless, had been her prison for years. She'd accepted it, molded herself around it. But this wasn't about walking. This was about deserving to walk. She spoke so softly it barely registered. "Will it hurt?" He nodded. "Yes, but I'll be right here." She sat in silence for a long time. Long enough for the ship to sigh beneath their feet and the stars beyond the viewport to realign themselves. Then, with a voice she hadn't used since before she was thrown away, she said, "Okay." He didn't smile, not fully. But his eyes softened, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them two broken histories daring to lean into a shared future. He set up the tools with quiet precision, explaining the process in words that calmed more than they confused. Nerve link, muscle synchronization, sensory adaptation. She didn't understand it all. But she understood his voice steady, grounded, real. When he touched her legs, she flinched, but didn't pull away. When the first pulse of energy surged through the device, her body convulsed. It felt like lightning inside bone. She screamed. But Calen didn't let go. He held her hand as the tech fused with her flesh, as old nerves lit up for the first time in years, as sweat poured down her face and sobs clawed out of her throat like ghosts. "It's okay," he whispered. "You're not alone. Breathe." She gritted her teeth, feeling each second stretch like eternity. But through the pain, something shifted. Something woke up. Then her foot moved. Just slightly. But enough. She looked down, tears blurring her vision, her chest shaking. I moved. Calen nodded, still holding her hand. Yes, you did. She looked at him, and for the first time, she didn't see a rescuer or a stranger. She saw someone who had chosen to believe in her before she ever believed in herself. And that, more than the machines humming beneath her skin, was the start of her becoming something new, not fixed, not enhanced. Just free. There was no going back the moment the first current surged through her spine. It didn't feel mechanical, it felt alive, like lightning wrapped in razors had been threaded through her nerves. Kaela convulsed. Her hands seized, eyes wide as fire bloomed behind her vision. She didn't scream at first, she held it in, teeth clenched so tight her jaw ached. But then it tore from her throat, sharp and feral, primal pain bursting from years of silence. She'd known agony before, bones broken under boots, skin torn by metal, hunger that gnawed through muscle, but this was different. This pain wasn't punishment, it was rebirth. She wanted to pull away, to curl into herself, to end it. Her mind begged her to stop. Her body flailed in revolt. She almost screamed for him to undo it, to take it back, to let her stay broken. But then she felt its warmth. His hand, still there, not gripping, not restraining, just steady, anchored. Calen's voice cut through the white noise like low thunder. Breathe, Kaela. You're not alone. Not alone. The words looped like a lifeline. The implant systems were old second-generation neurosteel lattice, bound to micro-reactive myocontrol threads. It wasn't supposed to hurt this much, not with anesthetics. But she hadn't wanted sedatives. She needed to feel it. Every spike, every burn, every scream. It was her price to pay for the crime of being discarded. The pain crescendoed, then shifted. Lower, deeper. Her back arched. The metal scaffolding along her spinal curve locked into place with a hiss, fusing to her tissue, extending tiny limbs that wormed into ruined muscles, whispering to her body in a language it had forgotten. Then it went quiet, still. Her breath was ragged, her skin soaked in sweat, pulse erratic. Then, movement. A twitch, subtle. So small it could have been a spasm. But she knew it wasn't. She felt it. Not like an echo, but like intent. Her foot, her right foot, it had moved. Not been dragged. Not spasmed, moved. She stared at it like it wasn't hers. Her voice caught in her throat, broken from screaming. I moved. Calen exhaled beside her. Not relief, not victory, just quiet presence. He didn't say I told you so, didn't celebrate. He just nodded. Yeah, you did. Tears welled in her eyes, uninvited, unannounced. She wasn't the kind who cried anymore. Mora's had beaten that out of her long ago. But this was different. These weren't tears of weakness. They were from something deeper. Something older than pain. Something like wonder. She looked at him, truly looked this time as a rescuer. Not as a strange human in a cleaner world, but as a tether. As someone who had not only seen her worth, but fought for it. Calen didn't look triumphant. He looked tired. Like a man who had seen too much failure to believe in miracles, until now. She whispered, not to him, but to the fractured self still caged inside her chest. It worked. He smiled faintly. It's only the first step. And it was. The first real step. Not of her legs, not of flesh, but of something larger. The first step away from the person she had been forced to become. A thing. A ghost. A discarded name. Now, for the first time, she wasn't just surviving. She was becoming. The first time she stood, the ship itself seemed to hold its breath. Metal groaned softly beneath her trembling feet, as if unsure whether to support or witness her. Her body shook not from fear, but from the rebellion of muscles that had long forgotten purpose. Her knees wobbled, her fingers clutched the wall like it might disappear, and her back, still lined with healing grafts, burned with fire hot enough to melt resolve. But she was standing, not carried, not lifted, not imagined. She was upright, flawed, fragile, and fully alive. Her breath came fast, shallow, chest rising like a storm beneath her ribs. Calen stood nearby, arms crossed loosely, watching with a calm that didn't dare interfere. You don't have to prove anything, he said, voice low, grounded. Her grip tightened on the railing. I want to. For me. He didn't argue, didn't smile, just nodded once, eyes steady like an anchor. The next step was worse. Her right foot lifted an inch, hovered like a hesitant prayer, then dropped. No grace, just raw will. She tried again, left foot this time. It scraped against the floor like it resented movement. Her balance faltered, her core folded. She fell. Before the impact, Calen was there catching her, not cradling, just stopping the fall. She looked up, furious, not at him, at herself, at the weakness, at the betrayal of her own flesh. I can't. Yes, you can, he replied, because you just did. The words didn't sound like comfort, they sounded like truth. He didn't help her stand again. He stepped back, let her try. And try she did. Again. And again, she fell. Cursed. Slammed her fists against the floor. But she got up. Always up. Because she was done crawling. She was done being beneath. She would stand if it shattered her. Later that night, sweat-soaked and limping, she sat on the ramp of the ship, staring at the neon haze of morass. The station hadn't changed. Still rotten, still cruel, still watching. But now it whispered. Rumors bled through the corridors like poison. The freak walks, the defect rises. Some laughed, some scowled. Others muttered that it was unnatural wrong, that the broken were meant to stay broken. That pain had a place, and it wasn't supposed to evolve. She felt their eyes, even from a distance. She didn't care. She had learned something more dangerous than walking. She had learned choice. Calen joined her, a thin strip of alloy in his hands. Silver, smooth, braided with a pulse wire that shimmered faintly. A gift, he said, holding it out. She took it, unsure. It's a tracker, he added before she could ask. Built into the band, if we ever get separated, I'll find you. She stared at it. No one's ever tried to find me before. I will. She slid it over her wrist. It clicked into place. Warm, light, like a promise not spoken, but lived. Inside the ship, the training room remained open. She returned to it every morning alone. Each time she fell less, stood longer, learned to balance without the walls. The implant still ached. Her body still resisted, but her spirit didn't break. Outside, the station turned colder. The whispers turned into threats. She heard them through the comm static, the coded messages, the slurred recordings. They hated what she had become. A reminder that even the forgotten could rise. But Kaela didn't shrink from it. She stood in full view now, on the deck, in the markets, not as a warning, as a challenge. They came when no stars were watching, quiet, efficient, bloodthirsty, shadows wrapped in armor, their steps soundless against the ship's hull, like they belonged to the vacuum itself. 3 of them, mercenaries bred for precision, eyes like glass and hearts like payment. They didn't come to steal, they came to erase. You should have let her rot, the tallest one sneered, rifle pointed steady at Calen's chest. Broken things aren't meant to stand. Calen stood at the ship's main terminal, shoulders squared, gaze unwavering. No armor, no weapon, just a voice laced with quiet defiance. You don't get to decide that. They didn't wait. The first shot tore through his shoulder flesh, split open, pain blooming red and fast. He fell hard, blood spilling across the deck like spilled ink. He tried to crawl, couldn't. His hands slapped the emergency panel, and the ship screamed to life. Sirens wailed, lights turned red, bulkheads began to seal. And Kaela woke. Smoke curled in the air like whispers from a dying god. Her room was dark, pulsing with warning lights. She heard it before she moved his voice, shouting, then silence. Something inside her snapped, not in fear, not in panic, but something older. Something that rose from a place deeper than instinct. She was on her feet before her mind caught up. Metal joints hissed, her legs roared with power and purpose. She didn't hesitate, didn't think, just moved. The hallway stretched like a battlefield already broken. The floor was slick. Her balance wavered, but her will didn't. She turned the corner and froze. Calen was on the ground, chest heaving, blood soaking through his shirt. One mercenary stepped over him, weapon raised for a final shot. Kaela didn't scream. She ran. Her body blurred through the smoke. She grabbed a loose metal rod from the wall, a simple thing, just a pipe butt in her hands. It became a blade. She struck the first one hard across the ribs. Armor cracked. He howled, stumbling. The others turned too late. The second came at her, fast and low, shock baton raised. She ducked under his swing and slammed the rod into his kneecap. Bone gave with a wet crunch. He collapsed, screaming. She didn't wait. She turned on the third. He was bigger, faster, smarter. His strike landed across her shoulder, sending electricity tearing through her arm. She dropped the rod, her vision blurred. But her legs, those beautiful, furious metal legs shelled. She surged forward, teeth clenched, and rammed her shoulder into his chest, knocking him back against the wall. He fired wild. Sparks lit the corridor. She grabbed the rod again. One last swing. The weapon struck the side of his helmet. It cracked, then shattered. He crumpled. The ship's defenses finished what she started. Steel doors slammed shut, locking the intruders inside the cargo hold, lights dimming as containment protocols kicked in. Then it was quiet again. She dropped the rod. Her breath tore through her lungs in jagged pulls as she dropped to her knees beside Calen. His eyes fluttered. His skin had gone pale. Blood pooled under him. "You're going to be okay," she said, pressing her hands to his wound. They shook, but not from fear. He looked at her, barely conscious. "You." She leaned in. "You saved me first." His mouth twitched like he wanted to smile. "Thought you hated fighting." "I do," she whispered, "but I hate losing you more." He tried to speak again, but she pressed a finger to his lips. "Shut up. You're terrible at dying." She didn't cry, not yet. She just held him there, her back against the smoke-filled corridor, her legs still buzzing with power, her heart cracked open wide and raw. For years, she'd been the one who needed saving. But tonight, she was the storm. And the storm didn't beg. It protected. His recovery was slow, like time decided to crawl alongside his healing. Bandages wrapped tight around his shoulder, painkillers dulling the edge but never the weight. Every breath he took was shallow, controlled, and each time he tried to sit up on his own, she was already there, gentle hands, firm eyes, a quiet refusal to let him do it alone. Kaela had seen pain before, worn it like second skin, but watching it in someone else, someone who had bled for her, that was new. The ship for once felt warm. Maybe it was the glow of the healing lights. Maybe it was the way silence stretched between them, now not tense, not unsure, but full of something unspoken. She brought him food, mostly broth at first, spooned with careful hands. The first time he teased her for oversalting it, she threatened to unplug his IV. He laughed. She did too. They both paused, surprised. She told him a story one night, something strange and half-remembered, a folk tale from her species' cradle world, about a moon spirit who lost her shadow and spent 1,000 years crossing the stars to find it. Her voice was quiet, unsure, like the story had waited too long inside her and wasn't quite sure how to come out. But he listened. Eyes half closed, smile faint, like the words were water, and he'd forgotten how thirsty he'd been. "Why are you still here?" he asked once, when the fever had faded and clarity returned. She looked at him, not with confusion, but with a kind of calm that came from choosing, not surviving. "You said I don't owe you anything." "You don't," he said again, like he needed her to hear it more than he needed to say it. "Then why do I want to stay?" she asked softly. "Why does it feel like if I walked away now, I'd lose something real?" His lips parted, but he didn't answer right away. Instead, he shifted, careful not to wince, and reached for the datapad by his bed. He tapped a few times, pulled up a word, turned the screen to her. "Bond." She frowned. "What is it?" "It's a human word," he said. "Means something that ties people together. Not blood, not law, just something chosen." She studied the word like it might vanish, then touched it. Not the screen, just the letters, as if feeling them might help her understand them better. "And you think that's what this is?" she asked. He nodded. "Yeah, I do." She was quiet for a while, then looked up, voice barely a whisper. "Then you're my bond." Something shifted in the room then. Nothing dramatic, no glowing lights or swelling music. Just two souls recognizing each other without needing permission. He didn't respond with words. He just reached out, palm up, open. She placed her hand in his. Not as thanks, not as obligation, but because, for the first time, she wanted to. Because someone had chosen her, and she was choosing him back. The message came without ceremony, no seal, no anthem, just a silent flash on the ship's console. The screen pulsed once, then filled with the emblem of the United Galaxial Forum, a ring of stars caged in artificial gravity, spinning like judgment dressed in bureaucracy. Calen read the transmission first, jaw clenched, eyes unreadable. Kaela watched him from across the room, the rhythm of his breathing louder than the engines. "They want us at Polaris Prime," he finally said, voice quiet. "Formal summons, under the Council's neutrality clause." She didn't respond right away. Polaris Prime wasn't just a city, it was a mirror held up to the galaxy's face. Clean, glassy, polished with pretense. It was where decisions were made by people who'd never felt dirt under their nails or blood on their hands. The place that would smile as it erased her. Calen turned the screen to her. She read the words, neutral, unbiased, ethically concerning case, possible violations, modification of genetically unstable organisms. A line buried in legal phrasing, stabbed deeper than anything else. Subjects of no recognized social value. They didn't want her story. They wanted a curiosity, an exhibit, a thing that should have died but didn't, a freak to parade through their courts so they could pat themselves on the back for tolerating her. "I'm not going," she said. Calen didn't argue. He just waited. "They'll twist it," she said, pacing now. "I'll be a show, not a statement. They'll stare at my legs and call it tech. They won't see me, just wiring and risk reports." He sat in silence, letting her spiral, letting her think. Then finally, he spoke. "They already stare. They already whisper. Let them." She stopped, turned. "They want a spectacle," he said. "Give them a storm." She laughed bitterly. "You think I can stand in front of them and, what? Convince them I'm real?" "I don't care what they believe," he said. "I care what you say." She looked down at her hands, the thin scars still fresh. Her legs, humming faintly beneath the skin with engineered strength. Her heart, louder than ever. She thought of the alley where she used to sleep, curled in trash. Of the guards who spat on her and called her a thing. Of the first time her foot moved because someone believed it could. "I won't be their proof," she said finally, voice low but steady. He tilted his head. "Then what will you be?" She met his eyes, and something shifted. "I'll be a voice. Not loud, not angry, just undeniable." And somewhere in that moment, the galaxy got smaller. Because she wasn't walking into their council to beg for recognition. She was walking in to remind them she was never theirs to classify. The marble floor of Polaris Prime didn't welcome her. It tested her. Every step echoed like a challenge thrown back at the ones who doubted she would ever take it. Her boots struck that pristine, mirrored surface with weight not from the alloy that now reinforced her legs, but from the truth she carried inside her. She walked unassisted. No cane, no guide, just her. Around her, rows of delegates watched from their floating seats like orbiting judgment, eyes hidden behind polished visors, voices low and venomous. Whispers slid across the chamber like cold air before a storm. That's the thing he fixed. She was supposed to die. Tech like that, it should be outlawed. And still, she walked. Kaela stopped at the center of the chamber, beneath the great halo of light that circled above like a synthetic sun. She didn't flinch. She didn't tremble. She simply stood and lifted her chin. She saw the counselors watching her like a specimen, but she saw something else too, the flicker behind their eyes. Not fear, not wonder. Guilt. Not because of what she was, but because they'd all chosen to look away when she was nothing. "I know what you see," she said, her voice clear, cutting through the silence like a scalpel. "You see metal, modification, violation of protocol." Her hand moved, slow and deliberate, and she raised her arm, the one fused with polished, neural-threaded alloy. The limb they called abomination. Her voice did not waver. "This isn't a violation. This isn't unnatural. This is survival." A ripple ran through the chamber. "I wasn't repaired. I was believed in. Not corrected. Chosen." They didn't speak, but their silence shifted. It grew heavier. She stepped forward. "You have rules for everything. Who's allowed to be seen? Who's allowed to be saved? You use words like worthy, functional, permitted to live." She took another step, the light catching on the line of scar that ran down her neck, a scar that marked the point where death nearly won. Not all life begins whole, but all life deserves to feel real. She paused. And I do. Because someone looked at what you all threw away and saw a person. No one moved, no rebuttals, no threats. She looked at each of them now, not as monsters, not as gods but as cowards, who had forgotten what it meant to believe in something beyond control. This isn't magic, she said. This is human kindness, and it's stronger than your laws. Her final words didn't rise. They sank, like a blade sliding into still water. I walked not because I was fixed, but because someone reminded me I was never broken. No applause followed, just stillness. And then one delegate stood, followed by another. No cheers, no fanfare. Just the quiet, solemn sound of heads bowing. Because for the first time in that polished, indifferent hall, they weren't listening to a freak. They were listening to a voice, and they couldn't ignore it anymore. She stood in the dim cabin, not because her legs were strong now, but because her soul had finally stopped shaking. The stars outside the viewport didn't jeer at her anymore, they just existed, quiet and endless, like they always had, indifferent to the things crawling and bleeding below them. But tonight, they watched. Tonight, she felt seen. Calen approached without sound, just the low hum of his steps against the ship's floor. In his hand was something small, silver, and unremarkable to anyone else but to her. It glowed with something more sacred than light. A badge, plain metal, curved edges, etched carefully by hand. No serial number, no ranking, no brand. Just a name. He held it out to her, as if offering a piece of truth the galaxy had long denied her. Kaela, it read. She blinked slowly. Her throat ached. Not from injury, but from the quiet inside her finally breaking. Not a defect, he said, voice low, steady. Not a tool, not a burden, not someone else's mistake. She touched the badge with reverence, fingers brushing the engraving as if afraid it would vanish, like every fleeting moment of kindness she'd once dared to believe in. A voice, he finished. And in those two words, the weight of the universe shifted. Her fingers tightened around the badge, not because she needed to hold it to believe it was hers, but because she'd never been given the right to hold her own name before. Her own identity, her own damn story. The ship drifted, quiet among stars that had watched civilizations rise and fall. But for Kaela, the silence no longer meant emptiness. It meant space room enough to breathe, to grow, to be. She turned toward the viewport again, watching light slide across blackness like scattered memory. For so long, I thought freedom would feel like flight, she whispered, but it feels heavier. Calen stepped beside her. Because real freedom doesn't make you forget the chains. It reminds you who you were when you broke them. She looked up at him. There was no romantic illusion between them, just gravity. Two souls tethered not by accident, but by choice. Is this victory? She asked, the badge cool in her palm. He didn't smile. Didn't offer some heroic line to cap off the pain and scars that had carried them here. No, he said, eyes never leaving hers. This is freedom. And somehow, that was bigger. Because victory is loud, temporary. It fades with cheers. But freedom, it's quiet. It whispers. It lingers. Kaela didn't nod, didn't cry. She simply stood taller. The badge went to her chest, pinned just above the faint seam where metal met flesh. Not to hide it, but to honor it. The stars outside no longer seemed distant. They were waiting. And this time, they weren't waiting for a defect to die. They were waiting for a voice to rise. She was abandoned, broken, and forgotten by a galaxy that measured worth in symmetry and silence. But she didn't just survive. She stood on rebuilt legs and an unbroken will. She spoke not as a subject, but as a soul. And in the end, she wasn't fixed. She was chosen. Not by fate, not by law. By him. Because sometimes the most powerful force in the universe isn't a weapon. It's a hand held out when everyone else turns away. And that bond, it changed everything. So, if you think that was the end of the story, you haven't seen what comes next. Subscribe to Alien Chronicles, because in the dark corners of forgotten worlds, we uncover the love, the wars, and the secrets they never wanted you to hear.